Ink-a-dink, 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 ink-a-dink. Wow!
Yeah, well, I think we're going to start off with who the hell is Bernie Sanders, all right? I mean, we know who Hillary is, we know who that guy Trump is, but this guy Bernie Sanders, I mean, I think somebody once said to me that he's a socialist. I mean, can we really talk about this? I mean, this is a democracy. I mean, does this guy mean anything?
Trump who?
Let's move on to the next card.
Yeah. But the difference is, unlike 8 years ago, when people kept saying, is he really in this country, America, and stuff like that, Bernie Sanders actually does say, and has said in the past, that he is a socialist.
He is a socialist.
Yeah.
But why does being a socialist have to be a bad thing? Helen Keller was a socialist. She
didn't get elected president.
No, she wasn't running for president, but she was trying to create medical reform because she felt, and was probably right to feel, that she may never have been blind and deaf, never had to go through the circumstances she went through, and other people wouldn't have had to if they had the proper medical care. These people were in a bad place financially, and that's why they had these medical issues, and that's why she fought for socialism in her later life.
Well, I think what happens, Leora, is that this whole term socialism, like in the 50s, during the Cold War, we had this horrible fear and aversion of communism, Russian communism, the Soviet Union, and communism and socialism sort of became interchangeable. So people are kind of afraid of that. They're afraid, number one, that if you're too much of a socialist and your ideas get into the government, then the government's going to be pretty involved in your life. The government's going to try and do a lot of things for you. And people are kind of apprehensive about that. Now, you're smiling, John Allen. You got something to say about that?
I do.
Go ahead.
If socialism is such a bad idea, then Social Security is a bad idea. All the Republicans who want to elect Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, they should mail back their Social Security checks if they're recipients of that, if they actually believe that. Social Security is socialism. Medicare is socialism. Medicaid is socialism. Public schools are socialism. If those are all bad ideas, I've been wrong for a long time.
I think somebody once told me that the military was socialist. I mean, the people are paying for it, and it's protecting them.
Yeah, 3 hots and a cot.
Yeah, but that's capitalism. You get paid for it, and you do a job.
All right.
Cops do a job.
No,
they get
in socialist countries, people get paid too.
I think that the thing that people are fearful about the word socialism is when the boundary is crossed between free enterprise and government control. Now, this country has been a great beneficiary of free enterprise. Remarkable what has been done here. People who pioneered in making steel and making electronics and whatnot. And in other places in the world where there was socialism that crossed that boundary into productivity, into what we consider the corporate domain, they really failed. And the Soviet Union is an example of that. And I think that from things that I've read, Bernie has to be very careful that he's not going to tread on free enterprise.
Well, Bernie refers to himself as a social democrat, or a democratic socialist. And I think this is really an important insight in what this particular, what we need at this time. To begin with, we live in a so-called capitalist system, free enterprise, capitalism. If you have a pure capitalist system, you're going to have a tremendous amount of innovation, you're going to have a tremendous amount of wealth, and you're going to have a tremendous amount of greed. And it just so happens that in a purely capitalistic system, all that wealth winds up sometimes in the hands of a few. You don't think so? Okay. Now, my thinking is we can somehow or other balance that greed and balance that inequity. All right? If we had a certain number of social programs to offset that, and maybe the only advocate, all right, that can actually put those social programs into effect and counteract the negative effects of capitalism would be the government.
But Joe, our country has always been a socialist system from the very beginning. It's just that it's been socialism for the rich. If you look at the tax benefits that wealthy families get to this day, industries, all these industries that claim they're Donald Trump has admitted that he's sought bankruptcy protection 4 times in his career because the tax laws are there for me to use. I don't agree with his motive for doing it because he leaves a lot of contractors unpaid and a lot of people out of business and puts small banks out of business. But that's the system. The system has been, the tax code has favored the rich. It always has since there's been a tax code. And the golden age of the wealthy families of this country, the J.P. Morgans and the Andrew Carnegies, that was socialism, I'll tell you, because the government worked on their side. If there was a strike at their plant, who got sent in? Soldiers to put down the strike. And those were soldiers that were sponsored by the American taxpayer.
No, that's partly because you have to remember that they chose the president. They chose McKinley. They chose these guys. They basically, as much as we say today that money controls government, you go back about 100 years or more, they literally chose the candidate. They literally chose the president. That was the big thing. There was a thing, it was not on PBS, a History Channel, called The Men Who Built America. And it talked about Vanderbilt, talked about J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller. They actually created their own PAC, which said, okay, we're going to pick this guy. We want him to run against William Jennings Bryan because we don't like him. And this guy will be our president. And basically, he became their president. There was a
good Republican named Theodore Roosevelt who broke that up, which is kind of interesting.
Well, that's because they made the mistake of making him vice president.
Extreme wealth is still picking our presidents. You have corruption of our democratic republic by wealth, and the corruption of a free enterprise with vulture capitalism that's using the accumulation of vast wealth, reduction of taxation on wealthy individuals, evasion of taxation in corporations, and all of that has diminished the middle class. Both parties are corrupted by big money. Sanctified now by the Supreme Court and the Citizens United decision that said money equals free speech. But if that's the case, then the people who control the vast wealth in this country, and what do they say, 400 families control more wealth than 65-70% of the population?
They have bigger mouths.
Yeah, how do you feel, though, that big enterprise is hurting directly the middle class? It seems to me that absent the growth of free enterprise, there would have been no middle class. It was these big corporations and their organizations that created jobs that were middle class jobs for machinists as opposed to maybe a blacksmith. Machinists got a good salary.
That's
back when. The people who sold, the people in marketing, all of these were the middle class jobs that grew. And what's happening now? I don't think it's a devil in the corporate higher echelon that's causing the demise of the middle class. The thing that's hurting the middle class, I think, is a change of the means of productivity. That is to say, the use of computers. The computers are absolutely hollowing out the middle class. And I don't mean to say computers are wrong by any means. But all of those jobs, making sure that that the parts were bought here and shipped there, and all of those things that took a lot of people are now done by computers, and it's causing a tremendous dent in the employment of the so-called
Yeah, but
middle
people
class.
said the same thing when the automobile was invented, and people said, "What about the stagecoach makers? You know, they're not going to have jobs."
And the buggy whip makers.
And the buggy whip makers. That's the same.
Yeah, you're talking about what you're
Luddite
talking
thinking
about
that,
is
about computers hollowing
Yeah,
out
but the
middle
thing
class.
is that what happened was when we industrialized, we went from people making individual things, like a wagon was made by a blacksmith and a few other people helping him with the wooden parts. But then, as the means of productivity went into mass production, the organization changed. There was more money available to pay workers, first of all, because there was more being produced by less people. And that's a very, very big issue. It takes a lot of people to make wagons. But on a production line, you're knocking out cars like cookies. And so there's more money being made by the corporation. And in the best of worlds, that money can be shared by a lot of people, and that became the middle class.
You don't think the production of solar
they were
panels
paid
is,
by that high productivity.
gonna create
And now,
jobs?
unfortunately, that's being hollowed out because of the advent of something, this beast, the computer, that can actually do what all of those middle class people
Well,
did
you know,
in
it's
the
not
past.
just the computer. I mean, there are technological advances that are permeating the entire society. All right? Now, we supposedly have a very healthy economy, but at the same time, there's a tremendous number of people out of work. All right?
we're in a disruptive
Okay,
economy.
so
right
there's a certain there are elements in the economy right now that are not favoring the people. Okay, and this is really where a guy like Bernie Sanders starts to make sense. Bernie Sanders talks about the fact that there is a tremendous amount of wealth in the hands of a few families. Okay, and those families are exploiting, literally exploiting, all right, the people.
That's why labels need to be less of our conversation and more about Bernie's issues as regarding the vast majority of Americans and the corruption, as I see it, of our political system and our representatives by big money.
You're absolutely right. And right now, I think we can really throw light on the situation by discussing some of Bernie Sanders' issues. Now, do you want to enlighten us on that a bit, Victor?
Income inequality, wealth distribution, CEO pay, which is at historically high levels, 400 times the average worker, the accumulation of vast wealth in very few hands, and the ability of that wealth to dominate, control our political processes, candidates, elections, legislation, to further their wealth. And that's what's happened.
Now, if Bernie Sanders is going to be a part of the political process, is he not going to require the funding, all right, that comes from this wealth?
No. He's going to get it from the people in $3 and $5 and $10. The people who are accepting the corporate big money campaign contribution bribes must put out. They must pay for that. And that means they're going to pass legislation that further empowers the wealthy, the military-industrial congressional complex, an endless war, and trillions of dollars diverted from critical civilian needs and priorities to military waste and corruption. All of that can be addressed.
John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, the wealth distribution. Don't make wealth distribution sound like a bad thing. I mean, the Republicans have always been, they've been really experts at that message. that what somebody like Bernie Sanders would
not
do.
The distribution.
What's that?
It's the redistribution of wealth that they have
redistribution,
issues with.
Right, but they label it as
Take
wealth
my money and give it to a lot of other people.
Right.
That's
Give it to
economics.
people on welfare. Give it to that old argument. But how about preventing these people who are getting obscenely wealthy in the last 10 or 15 years from taking their money offshore, where it's not subject to American taxes? They're allowed to put it in tax havens. It's something that Bernie's really addressed in detail, which is really great.
He's against that.
Absolutely.
That sounds like
and all
something.
he's talking about is fairness. He's not trying to put anybody out of business, but he's talking about fairness. He's talking about tax fairness. He's talking about a living wage that somebody can actually feed their family on.
I think he even said $15 an hour.
$15 an hour. Seattle's done it, and the businesses are not fleeing from Seattle, Washington.
Yeah. But different states have different levels of costs.
Okay, so you can have regional adjustment for things. I'll buy that. I mean, it's like if you get a per diem expense account for a sales job, in Dubuque, Iowa, you shouldn't require as much hotel money as you require to do it in New York City. I get that.
Yeah.
Let's pin this down. Are you saying that Bernie is for more equity in terms of
fairness?
Fairness. When it comes to taxes, when it comes to minimum wage,
Yep.
and what else is on the Bernie Sanders agenda that's going to be beneficial to us Americans? What else?
Well, I think he's going to move us closer to a single-payer healthcare system, which is what he's promoted all along. And why are we the only developed industrial country in the world that doesn't have a single-payer system?
Does that mean everybody on Medicare?
Social Security for all. It's Social Security for all. It provides a floor for minimal medical care. It doesn't provide you with luxurious medical care necessarily, but our neighbors to the north, Canada, they do it. I have friends who live in Toronto. They think we're a bunch of chumps for doing medical care the way we do it. American citizens don't.
Well, we got Obamacare, don't we?
Yes, but that was a gift to insurance companies. Don't mistake that. Don't mistake that for single payer.
All right.
Because that was a gift to the insurance companies. It was a step in the right direction because now, for the first time in history, people with pre-existing conditions are covered when they apply for medical insurance.
Your children till they're 26.
You can cover your kids on your plan till you're 26. There are a lot of benefits, but it's got a long way to go. And Bernie's got a good plan to kick at that last 50 yards.
But will he be able to get legislation through Congress?
That's where leadership comes in. You make it so that these idiots can't have no place to hide. I mean, that's what real leadership does, is that it creates a situation where they have no place to hide, and it puts them in a position where they have to move in that direction. But everybody we compete with Japan, we compete with
China.
Well, no. That's not a democratic.
Competition?
No. It's competition. But we saw what happened this past week to their false economy.
Yeah.
But all the European common market countries, all the freely elected democracies that we compete with, every one of them, to the country, people live longer than they do in this country. So what does that say about our healthcare system? We rank 39th or 40th, the last I looked, in the world for longevity.
John, our healthcare system right now, is in the hands of insurance companies, medical industries. That's the power. Pharmaceuticals. That's the money.
It's a for-profit system at its core.
Well, there's nothing.
And that's why you have a $500 Band-Aid.
There's nothing wrong with for-profit, but you can regulate what is a fair amount of profit, a fair amount of return for somebody's investment, and when they're not subsidized by taxpayers to get that unfair return. So the tax code, you do it through the tax code, and they end up paying, when they pay their fair share, everybody wins. They win too.
Well, I don't know, if controlling what happens to capital is the right approach. But
That isn't what I said.
people who operate corporations that have huge amounts of capital, because of the structure of corporations and the manner in which voting goes on the part of the shareholders, it turns out that the hierarchy of these corporations are able to pay themselves huge salaries, which are
interlocking
absolutely
directorates.
disproportionate.
You wanted to add,
right?
Leora?
Well, I was just going to say that, for-profit doesn't work if people aren't getting the medical care I need, and I was going to say, just from my own personal experience, if I'm allowed to.
You're allowed to.
Okay, from my own personal experience, I used to take a certain medication to help me, and the thing with some medications is, there's a general blanket, this is prescribed for this specific thing. Sometimes you need to use a medication that's technically for something else, but it works for what you have, which your doctor finds out and he prescribes that for you. And then the insurance company will say, well, you don't have this disease that this medication is for, even though your doctor says and has written repeated appeals saying that this medication helps you with the problem that you have. Since you don't have the problem that the medication is actually for, we're not going to pay for it. Then you have to switch medications, and you might not find another medication that works. You'll be having problems on the phone to your doctor after midnight, day after day, because again, personal experience, but people's insurance companies are all well and good, and they're useful, but their goal shouldn't be making profit first. And that's the problem with a completely capitalist system. That's the problem with the system that we have, is that if everybody's goal is making money and not things like making sure that people's medical care is actually helping them, which is the most important thing when it comes to medical care, then that's the problem.
Well, Leora, that's the purpose of insurance companies. I mean, they take risks, and they take the kinds of risks that they need to in order to make a profit. And this is definitely going to conflict with health decisions.
Yes, but you're going to get the counter argument, and it's been made before by people who on the other side of the argument, that look, if it weren't for the for-profit, if company A came up with the medication that she wanted, but they couldn't make any money by it, guess what? They wouldn't make that medication. The medications that we have that come out of this country are the foremost in the world. You may say that Japan has a better medical system, but by and large, a lot of the medical care they're getting is American pharmaceuticals from American pharmaceutical companies, prescribed originally by American doctors.
Do you know what the three most profitable drugs are in the market right now?
I'm guessing one of them is Viagra.
Erectile dysfunction drugs are the three most profitable drugs in big pharma right now.
Yeah, but that's because they discovered that it helps circulate your blood better.
And that was the original intent of it.
And if they hadn't, there wouldn't be any Viagra.
There's an injection that you can give or can be given to your pet for Lyme's disease. That injection is not available to us because we have to take antibiotics. And if enough of us are taking antibiotics all the time, this is beneficial to the pharmaceutical industry. If we just got one shot, one injection, that would take care of us, let's say, maybe for the year, it's not really as financial advantageous. We'll let our dogs die before we put them on antibiotics that are going to make us broke. So therefore, if the pharmaceutical company is going to make any profits in the veterinary area, that inoculation will exist.
One thing that the Canadians do that's a little different, back to Canada before I lose the thought, this friend of mine from Toronto who benefited from the Canadian medical system when his wife couldn't conceive, he went through in vitro fertilization, and it was all paid for by the Canadian healthcare system with a very small copay on his part. But with the Canadian system, I asked them about pharmaceuticals. And pharmaceuticals, it's very interesting. If a drug company like Ciba Geigy wants to sell a drug in Canada, they have to justify. They have to go through an elaborate justification for the price that they're charging for that drug, to prove, minus the research and development cost. And most research and development costs for drug companies in this country are funded by the taxpayers, folks, through the Centers for Disease Control. So don't listen to the nonsense that a pharmaceutical company feeds you about how much it costs them to develop the drug.
Oh, so
they don't develop it; they just market it.
I don't even pay for it.
So the Canadians got smart. They decided a few years ago that any drug that's going to go to market in Canada has to be justified in their national health care system what they're going to charge for that drug. As a result, they pay a tiny fraction for commonly prescribed drugs, for statin drugs, cardiac-related stuff. They pay a fraction of what we pay. And these aren't generics.
This is what Bernie Sanders has in mind for...
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Another thing Bernie's going to do is financial reform of the banks, financial industry, reinstatement of an updated Glass-Steagall Act, which by itself it needs more than that, to hold robbing people with a fountain pen accountable. Something that this past administration, this current administration, and A.G. Holder never did.
Reflect quickly on Glass-Steagall before you go on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we all know what Glass-Steagall did, I think, is to separate mom and pop banks, mortgage banks, from financial gambler banks.
Investment banks.
That create like the derivatives and other financial instruments by which they create vast wealth.
And that was put in by FDR and his.
And it was eliminated by Bill Clinton.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Bill Clinton, under pressure from the Rubinite economists, Robert Rubin's crowd, which surprised President Obama, hired most of them for his administration and continued that process. But I think Bernie and Elizabeth Warren both recognize that we must do something to rein in financial parasitism.
You got Wall Street, you got banking, you've got the pharmaceutical industry.
Don't separate the two.
I mean, the thing.
Actually, that's what Glass-Steagall was supposed to do.
They say they'd rob your grandma blind on Wall Street, fritter her away her Medicare on Wall Street. And Pharma Oil and their pet fox don't care if she lives in a box, so long as they wear platinum jocks on Wall Street, Meow.